The Seoul skyline ignited in a bruising orange as the sun dipped behind the Latte World Tower, casting long, predatory shadows across Seo Tae-Gun's penthouse. High above the city, the air in the medical suite was clinical, scrubbed clean of life, smelling only of sterile gauze and the sharp, metallic tang of the specialized monitors keeping watch over a kingpin. Talia stood exactly 4 feet from the edge of his bed, her hand resting on the pulse oximeter, her royal blue dress of calm lake in a room designed for storms. For 6 months, this had been their dance, the silent nurse and the monster she was tasked with healing. Tae-Gun didn't thank her for the life she'd saved. He simply watched her with eyes that calculated the cost of every soul in the city below. He didn't need a scalpel to open someone up. He used his silence, a weapon he had honed until it was sharper than any blade. Talia's phone vibrated, a sharp, digital heartbeat in the quiet. She checked the screen, and for a fleeting second, the stoic shield she wore as a uniform vanished. She smiled, a look of genuine, soft anticipation that Tae-Gun realized, with a punch to his gut, was a warmth he had never been allowed to feel. "I'm leaving at 8:30, she said, her voice as cool and final as a closing ledger. "Your evening vitals are stable. The night shift is already briefed." Tae-Gun's gaze didn't shift from the window. "We have the physical therapy intake at 9 o'clock. Cancel your plans." Talia dropped her phone into her bag with the click of a deadbolt. "I can't. I have a date tonight." The room didn't just go quiet. It went dead. It was a heavy, suffocating silence of a predator deciding whether to let its prize walk away or break it in two. Then the explosion. With a roar that ripped through the clinical perfection of the suite, Tae-Gun lunged. He didn't reach for her. He reached for the silver, heirloom cigarette box on the nightstand, his anchor, the one thing that kept his darkness disciplined. In one violent arc, he threw it. The silver shattered against the glass wall, cigarettes scattering like white bones across the floor. "His name is Kang Dae." Tae-Gun's voice cut through the aftermath like a serrated blade. Talia froze, her hand inches from the door handle. "He's a venture capitalist." Tae-Gun continued, his rage suddenly replaced by a terrifying, surgical calm. "Educated in London. Drives a silver Porsche, and right now he's ordering a bottle of wine at the Orchid Room, while checking his reflection, unaware that every digital footprint he's ever left is currently being erased." Talia turned slowly, her blue dress catching the dying fire of the sunset. Her face was a mask of defiance, but Tae-Gun could see the pulse hammering at the base of her throat, the one tell she could never quite hide from him. The clinical stillness of the penthouse was gone, replaced by a jagged, electric vibration that felt like the air itself had been set on fire. Seo Tae-Gun stood amidst the wreckage of his own composure, his chest heaving under the thin, expensive silk of his unbuttoned shirt. At his feet, the special silver cigarette box lay twisted and empty, a discarded relic of a discipline he had just shredded in front of the only person who had ever seen him bleed. Talia Noire Whitfield did not move. She didn't flinch at the sound of the silver striking the glass, nor did she look at the cigarettes scattered like spent casings across the marble floor. She remained a statue of royal blue silk, her eyes never wavering from the glowing screen of her phone. To Tae-Gun, her calm was a more effective weapon than any suppressed pistol. It was a silent declaration that his rage, his power, and his history meant nothing compared to the 9 p.m. deadline ticking toward her. "Did you hear me?" Tae-Gun's voice dropped to a register that usually preceded a massacre, a low, guttural vibration that made the monitors beside his bed hum in sympathetic resonance. "I told you to cancel it." Talia finally looked up, but not at him. She checked her reflection in the darkened floor-to-ceiling windows, adjusting a stray curl near the platinum clip in her hair. "I heard you, Tae-Gun. I simply chose not to obey. My shift ended 5 minutes ago. As your nurse, I'm telling you to watch your blood pressure. As a woman with plans, I'm telling you good night." Tae-Gun moved then, a blur of predatory grace that brought him inches from her. He was close enough to smell the faint, floral scent of her perfume mixing with the sharp, burnt aroma of the tobacco he'd just forsaken. He towered over her, his neck tattoo, the vine of thorns, seeming to tighten with every jagged breath he took. "You think this is a game?" he hissed, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You think you can just walk out that door and sit across from a man Who doesn't know the first thing about the world you live in? Talia met his gaze finally, her dark eyes as cool and deep as the Pacific. That's the point, isn't it? He doesn't know. He doesn't look at me and see a ledger of secrets or a witness to be managed. He looks at me and sees a woman he wants to know. She stepped around him, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic cadence against the floor, the sound of a door closing in his face. Tae-Gun felt a jolt like a blade between his ribs. For the first time in his life, his wealth, his influence, and his capacity for violence were useless. He was a king in a glass castle, watching his most prized possession walk toward the elevator without a single backward glance. The silence that followed her departure wasn't quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating weight of the storm that had already broken, leaving him standing alone in the ruins of the only peace he had ever known. The elevator doors were seconds from sealing Talia away when a sound more chilling than the earlier explosion stopped her. The dry, rhythmic tap of a finger against a tablet screen. Tae-Gun hadn't followed her. He had retreated to the shadows of his mahogany desk, the blue light of the device illuminating the sharp, skeletal angles of his face. Kangdae isn't a venture capitalist, Talia. He doesn't even exist. Tae-Gun's voice was no longer a roar. It was a clinical, detached tone of a man dismantling a rival's empire. He swiped his finger across the screen, and a high-definition image of Talia's date flickered onto the massive wall-mounted monitors of the suite. The man was handsome, smiling, and utterly hollow. His real name is Seo. He's a specialized asset out of the Nam-Sun Triad, trained specifically in deep-cover infiltration. Tae-Gun continued, his eyes finally lifting to meet hers. He didn't meet you by chance at that medical conference last month. He was placed there because they know I survived 3 attempts on my life this year, and they realize the only way to get to my heart is through the woman who monitors its beat. Talia's hand remained on the elevator sensor, but her posture shifted, the professional mask flickering. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at Tae-Gun, searching for the lie. You're reaching, Tae-Gun. You're trying to burn my world down, because you can't stand that you aren't the center of it. I don't reach. I liquidate, he countered, his voice dropping to a whisper that filled the cavernous room. He tapped the screen again, bringing up a financial ledger. At 4:12 p.m. today, a shell company linked to the Triads deposited $300,000 into an offshore account in Seoul's name. His bonus, for securing a second date, by 9:15 p.m., he was supposed to have planted a localized tracker in your bag. By midnight, my location would have been a pinpoint on a hitman's HUD. He stood up, walking slowly toward her, the tablet still clutched in his hand like a cursed scripture. He stopped just outside her reach, the wreckage of his special cigarette box crunching beneath his leather shoes. The destruction of his discipline suddenly made sense. He hadn't just been angry. He had been terrified for her. I've spent the last 3 hours erasing him, Tae-Gun said, showing her the final slide, a digital 404 error on the man's social profiles and bank records. His identity is gone. His flight out of Incheon is booked for 1 hour from now. If he shows up at that restaurant tonight, it will be to meet my security team, not you. He leaned in closer, his breath ghosting over her ear, his voice losing its iron edge for a single, vulnerable second. He was a ghost, Talia. A beautiful, curated ghost designed to take you away from me. I didn't throw that box because I was jealous of a date. I threw it because I realized I'm the only monster in this city allowed to keep you safe. Talia looked at the empty screen where her perfect date had once been. The silence that followed was different now. Not the silence of predator, but the cold, heavy realization that in Tae-Gun's world, even a smile was a tactical strike. She didn't leave, but she didn't step back toward him either. She stood in the liminal space of the doorway, caught between the ghost she had lost and the demon who had saved her. Talia didn't move toward the monitors to inspect the digital wreckage of her evening. Instead, she stood perfectly still, the blue light of the screens casting long, ghostly shadows across her face. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the heavy weight of Tae-Gun's rage. It was the sharp, surgical coldness of a woman who had spent 6 months preparing for the moment her captor finally realized he couldn't own her. You think you've erased the only threat in this room, Tae-Gun? Her voice was a low, steady hum that cut through the clinical air. She didn't look like a nurse anymore. She looked like a strategist surveying a battlefield. You spent 3 hours dismantling a ghost. I've spent 6 months dismantling a king. She reached into the small, hidden pocket of her sapphire dress and pulled out a matte black flash drive, holding it between 2 fingers like a glass shard. Tae-Gun's eyes narrowed, his predatory gaze tracking the small device. He had built an empire on information, on knowing where every digital skeleton was buried. But for the first time, he saw a variable he hadn't accounted for. In your world, power is shipping hubs and wire transfers, Talia said, her voice gaining a dangerous, rhythmic edge. In mine, power is the fact that your left ventricular ejection fraction is at 40%. It's a specific dosage of the anticoagulant that keeps you from stroking out every time you lose your temper. It's the 3-page list of allergies and the precise neurological tremors you've been hiding from your board of directors. Tae-Gun took a step forward, his hand twitching toward the discarded silver box on the floor. You're a healer, Talia. You wouldn't. I was a healer until you made me a prisoner, she countered, her eyes flashing with fire that matched the orange Seoul sunset. This is my black book, Tae-Gun. Every medical vulnerability, every physical weakness, and every clinical secret that makes the great Seo Tae-Gun a mortal man is encrypted on this drive. I've set it on a dead man switch. If I don't check in with a secure server every 12 hours, your entire medical history, the proof that you are unfit to lead the syndicate, goes live to every rival you've ever crossed. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Tae-Gun looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the steel beneath the royal blue silk. He had thought he was protecting a bird in a cage, unaware that she had been studying the lock from the inside. The medical ransom wasn't just about money or safety. It was her declaration of independence. This is my ticket out of Seoul, she whispered, the drive catching the fading light. You can kill the ghosts who come for me, and you can burn the restaurants where I try to have a life. But you will not stop me from leaving. You told me earlier that you're the only monster allowed to keep me safe. Well, Tae-Gun, meet the monster you created. Tae-Gun didn't roar this time. He didn't throw anything. He simply stood in the center of his shattered office, paralyzed by the realization that the woman he had obsessively tried to protect had become the only person in the world capable of destroying him with a single click. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had inverted. He wasn't the keeper anymore. He was the patient, and she held the cure to his survival in the palm of her hand. Tae-Gun did not reach for the flash drive, nor did he lunge to bridge the distance between them. Instead, his gaze fell to the floor, where the twisted silver of the cigarette box lay beneath the cold glow of the Seoul skyline. The vial in the throat had left a permanent gouge in the expensive glass partition, a jagged starburst reflecting the ruin of his own composure. For the first time since Talia had known him, the predatory light in his eyes flickered, replaced by a hollow, haunting fatigue. You think that drive is the only thing keeping me from destroying you, Talia? He spoke softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the city lights. He walked to the wreckage and knelt, picking up a single, crushed cigarette with fingers that trembled with a suppressed, ancient rage. This box wasn't a habit. It was a prison cell. He looked up at her, the intricate vine of thorns on his neck seeming to pulse with every word. 7 years ago, I stood in a basement in Incheon, covered in the blood of men who tried to take my father's life. I realized that there's a part of me, a dark, starving thing, that doesn't know when to stop. It doesn't care about leverage or medical history or the rules of the syndicate. It only knows how to burn. He stood up slowly, the silver box clutched in his palm like a jagged tooth. My father gave me this box on his deathbed. He told me that as long as I kept the cigarettes inside dry and the silver polished, I was still a man of discipline. He told me that the moment I broke that ritual, the monster would take the wheel. For 3 years, I haven't touched a drop of smoke. I used the craving to sharpen my mind, to stay cold, to stay precise. I used it to become the king you spent 6 months studying. He took a step toward her, his unbuttoned shirt fluttering in the draft of the open balcony. The clinical, controlled Seo Tae-Gun was gone, replaced by something far more raw and unpredictable. When you told me you were going to that date, when I saw that smile you gave a stranger, a smile you never wasted on the man who keeps the world at bay for you, the discipline didn't just slip, it died. I threw that box because I realized the anchor was gone. I'm not the man who follows the rules of the Black Book anymore, Talia. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy with the realization that she had successfully neutralized the boss. But in doing so, she had unleashed a man. The flash drive in her hand felt suddenly light, almost insignificant. She had threatened a strategist with information. But how do you threaten a man who has just intentionally destroyed his own conscience? Tae-Gun dropped the silver wreckage back onto the marble with a final, echoing clang. The medical records tell you how to stop my heart, he whispered, his eyes locking onto hers with terrifying, newfound clarity. But they don't tell you how to survive me now that I have nothing left to lose. You wanted to see the monster you created? Look closer. I'm finally breathing without the silver, and I find I don't care if the whole city burns, as long as you're the one holding the match. The heavy silence following Tae-Gun's confession was not broken by words, but by a sudden, violent shudder that vibrated through the floorboards. In the distance, the low hum of the penthouse's dedicated power grid sputtered, and the floor-to-ceiling windows, once a transparent barrier between them and the world, flickered into an opaque, security-locked gray. The ambient orange glow of the Seoul sunset was instantly replaced by the rhythmic, crimson pulse of the emergency strobes. Tae-Gun's head snapped toward the hallway, his posture shifting from a man in emotional ruin back to a predator sensing a kill. The glitch in his legendary composure had done more than scatter his cigarettes. It had created a momentary lapse in the iron-clad surveillance protocols he usually maintained with religious fervor. His enemies, who had been circling the building like sharks sensing blood in the water, had found their opening the second his focus had shifted from his monitors to Talia's smile. The secondary perimeter is down, Tae-Gun whispered, his voice stripped of all vulnerability and replaced with a terrifying, flat precision. He didn't need to check a screen to know that the silence from his security detail was final. A muffled explosion echoed from the elevator lobby, followed by the distinctive, metallic chatter of suppressed submachine guns. The Syndicate's inner circle, sensing his instability, had accelerated their coup. They weren't just coming for his title anymore. They were coming to erase the man who had allowed a nurse to become his greatest liability. Talia stepped back, her fingers tightening around the flash drive. The crimson light of the emergency strobes hit the royal blue silk of her dress, making it appear almost black, like a deepening bruise. She looked at the door, then at Tae-Gun, who stood in the center of the room, unarmed and unbuttoned, yet looking more dangerous than she had ever seen him. "Get behind the reinforced glass in the medical suite," Tae-Gun commanded, his eyes tracking the shadows moving against the frosted glass of the main entrance. "The dead man switch on that drive won't save you if they blow the door. They don't want the records, Talia. They want the vacuum I'll leave behind." A heavy thud shook the double doors, the sound of a hydraulic ram beginning its work. The clinical perfection of the penthouse was being systematically dismantled by the outside world. Tae-Gun didn't move toward the weapons locker hidden behind his desk. Instead, he reached into the shadows of the bookshelf and pulled out a jagged, heavy length of industrial steel, a piece of the very architecture he had built. "They think I'm weak because I'm broken," Tae-Gun said, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate beneath the sound of the encroaching gunfire. He turned to Talia, a dark, feral grin cutting across his face. "They're about to find out that a monster without an anchor doesn't fight to win. He fights to destroy everything in the room." The main doors groaned, the steel hinges screaming under the pressure. As the first flashbang grenade rolled across the marble floor, Tae-Gun didn't flinch. He stepped into the light, a silhouette of ink and rage, ready to show the shadows in the hallway exactly why he had needed a prison for his soul in the first place. Talia dived from the medical suite, the scent of gunpowder and ozone replacing the smell of sandalwood as the penthouse transformed from a sanctuary into a slaughterhouse. The scream of the hydraulic ram finally gave way to the deafening roar of a shaped charge. The penthouse doors didn't just open, they disintegrated, sending shards of lacquered wood and steel whistling through the air like shrapnel. Through the haze of drywall dust and aconic smoke, the first wave of hitmen emerged. Shadows clad in tactical black, their movements a disciplined contrast to the visceral, unhinged fury of the man waiting for them. Talia pressed her back against the reinforced glass of the medical suite, her lungs burning with the acrid scent of ozone. This was it. The chaos she had prayed for, the momentary lapse in the king's dominion that would allow her to slip through the service exit and vanish into the labyrinth of Seoul. She gripped the black flash drive, her knuckles white. The dead man switch was active. The elevator in the rear hall was still powered by the emergency bank. She had 10 seconds to choose between the life she had been mourning and the man who had turned her into a weapon. A wet, heavy thud drew her eyes back to the center of the room. Tae-Gun was a whirlwind of dark ink and jagged steel, but even a monster has its limits. A stray round from a suppressed submachine gun had found its mark, tearing through his shoulder and painting the royal blue carpet with spray of crimson that matched Talia's dress. He didn't fall. He didn't even scream. But the hitch in his breathing was a sound Talia knew with clinical intimacy. It was a sound of a lung beginning to collapse, of a rhythm she spent 6 months stabilizing, finally falling into a terminal discord. He took another step, the heavy industrial steel in his hand, swinging in a brutal arc that silenced another intruder, but the trail of blood he left behind was terrifying. He was fighting with the strength of a man who had already accepted his death, his darker side fully unleashed, but his body was failing the ghost of the discipline he had thrown away. Talia's hand touched the handle of the exit door. The hallway was clear. The path to her freedom was a straight line into the cool night air. But then she saw Tae-Gun's face in the strobe light. Not the face of the Mafia boss who demanded obedience, but the face of the patient who had looked at her with raw, terrifying fear of being alone. She looked at the flash drive, then at the trauma kit sitting on the sterile counter beside her. "Damn you, Tae-Gun," she hissed, the words lost in the thunder of another grenade. She didn't run for the exit. She lunged for the trauma kit, her royal blue silk catching the light as she sprinted back into the kill zone. She wasn't a prisoner anymore, and she wasn't a victim. She was the only person in the world who knew how to put the king back together. She reached him just as he stumbled, his back hitting the mahogany desk. Talia didn't hesitate. She dived into the shadow of his massive frame, her hands already tearing open a pack of hemostatic gauze. "I told you to run," Tae-Gun wheezed, his eyes unfocused, blood blooming across his shirt like a dark flower. "And I told you that you were my patient," Talia countered, her voice steady even as a bullet shattered a vase inches above her head. She shoved the gauze into the wound with a clinical coldness that matched his own. "You don't get to die until I say your shift is over." Tae-Gun looked down at her, a strange, broken laugh escaping his lips. He leaned his weight against her, the monster and the healer huddling together in the ruins of an empire as the second wave of shadows began to close in. The chaos outside the mahogany desk became a blurred symphony of gunfire and shouts, but within the small radius of Talia's reach, the world narrowed to the scent of blood and the steady, rhythmic hiss of Tae-Gun's labored breathing. She had dragged him into the alcove of the medical suite, the reinforced glass now scarred with spiderwebs from the ongoing assault. Here, the roles they had inhabited for 6 months didn't just blur, they evaporated. Tae-Gun lay back against the cold marble floor, his head lolling against the base of a surgical cabinet. The man who had commanded shipping hubs with a flick of a pen was now reduced to a series of urgent biological failures. Talia worked with a terrifying, silent efficiency. She didn't look like the nurse who had spent months enduring his icy stares. She looked like a deity, presiding over a fallen king. "Stay still," she commanded, her voice a sharp, surgical edge that brooked no defiance. She sliced through the fine silk of his shirt with trauma shears, exposing the jagged entry wound in his shoulder. Tae-Gun winced, his fingers digging into the carpet, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't. His strength was draining into the sapphire blue of the rug, leaving him physically tethered to the woman he had tried so desperately to own. For the first time, he was the one looking up, his gaze caught in the orbit of her absolute authority. He was vulnerable, his life literally held between her blood-slick fingers, and the realization seemed to hit him harder than the bullet. Talia reached for a local anesthetic and a probe, her movements precise despite the vibration of another explosion nearby. "The bullet is lodged against the scapula. I have to go in." Tae-Gun's hand reached out, grasping her wrist, not with the crushing force of Mafia boss, but with a desperate, grounding grip. "Do it," he rasped, his eyes locking onto hers. In that gaze, the king was absent. There was only a man terrified of the dark, looking at the only light he had left. As she worked, the silence between them became a living thing, a surgical silence that was louder than the battle raging in the hallway. Talia didn't flinch as she navigated the internal damage, her face a mask of clinical detachment that mirrored the coldness Tae-Gun usually reserved for his enemies. She was the one holding the power of life and death now. With a single slip, she could let the monster bleed out. With a single stitch, she could bind him to her forever. Tae-Gun watched her, his breath hitching as the probe found the metal. He saw the sweat on her brow, the focus in her eyes, and the way she didn't even acknowledge the sirens wailing in the distance. He realized then that he had never truly known her. He had seen a nurse, an asset, a prize. But he had never seen a woman who could stare down a war zone to fulfill a vow. The bullet dropped into a metal tray with a sharp, final ping. Talia didn't celebrate. She immediately began to pack the wound, her hands moving with a grace that felt like a benediction. Tae-Gun's grip on her wrist loosened, his body sagging as the immediate threat of shock receded. He was hers now, in a way that had nothing to do with contracts or surveillance. He was alive because she had chosen him over her own freedom, and as she looked down at him, he finally saw the truth. She hadn't stayed because she was afraid of him. She had stayed because she was the only one brave enough to keep him. The rhythmic pulse of the emergency lights bathed the medical suite in a deep, visceral red, casting Talia's shadow over Tae-Gun as she finished bandaging the entry wound. The distant rattle of gunfire had ebbed into a tense, temporary lull, leaving only the sound of their shared, ragged breathing. Tae-Gun's hand remained anchored to her wrist, but the pressure had changed. It was no longer an act of possession, but a desperate confession of gravity. "You think the flash drive is your only way out," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry earth shifting underfoot. He leaned his head back against the surgical cabinet, his face pale but his eyes burning with a lucidity that made Talia's breath catch. "You think I've been holding you here as a prisoner because I'm afraid of what you know. But you only know what I've allowed you to see, Talia." Talia paused, her fingers hovering over the medical tape. "I saw the surveillance, Tae-Gun. I saw the way you dismantled a man's entire life just because he asked me for dinner. Don't try to dress your obsession in a suit and tie." Tae-Gun let out a soft, pained huff that might have been a laugh. He reached for his phone, which had miraculously survived the firefight, and slid a finger across the cracked screen. He didn't show her the dossier of a ghost this time. He showed her a deed, a legitimate iron-clad property transfer for a medical clinic in a quiet, coastal town in southern France, far from the neon reach of the Seoul triads. "It's not just a clinic," he whispered, swiping to show a bank account in her name, filled with enough clean, laundered wealth to last 3 lifetimes. There are papers for a new identity, a doctorate in specialized trauma surgery, and a security detail that doesn't answer to the syndicate. I've been building it for 4 months. Every time I looked at you and saw the way you hated this room, I added another brick." Talia's hand dropped from his shoulder. The shock was more profound than the sound of the earlier explosion. "Why?" "Because I knew I was a sinking ship," Tae-Gun admitted, his gaze drifting to the shattered silver cigarette box across the room. "I vetted that man tonight because I was terrified he was the one the syndicate would use to find you once I was gone. I wasn't protecting my property, Talia. I was trying to ensure that when you finally walked away from me, you walked into a life where no one could ever put you back in a cage. Not the triads, not the feds, and especially not me." He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting the crimson strobes. "The black book you were keeping? I knew about it. I let you keep it because I wanted you to have a weapon against me if I ever lost my mind. I wanted you to have the power to destroy the king so the woman could survive." The silence that followed was heavy with the truth that rewritten their entire 6-month history. Talia looked at the clinical, expensive world around them, the glass, the steel, the blood, and realized that while she'd been planning a heist for her freedom, Tae-Gun had been engineering a miracle for her escape. The monster hadn't been hoarding her. He had been shielding her from the fire he knew was coming for them both. The flash drive in her pocket suddenly felt cold, a relic of a war she had already won, without realizing he was on her side. Talia let the tablet slip from her hand, the image of her future life in France flickering before it went dark. The weight of his gift didn't feel like a liberation. It felt like a final, crushing blow to her agency. She stood up, her royal blue dress torn and stained with his blood, looking down at the man who had tried to play God with her soul. The emergency strobes continued their rhythmic, bloody pulse, but the air between them had grown cold enough to freeze. "You think this makes it better?" she asked, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a burgeoning, righteous fury. "You think buying me a clinic and a new name is an act of love? You spent months watching me, tracking my every heartbeat, anticipating my every move, and then you built me a cage in a different country and called it sanctuary." Tae-Gun looked up at her, the blood loss making his features look sharper, more skeletal. "I gave you a way out, Talia. I gave you everything I am not allowed to have." "No!" she snapped, stepping over the scattered cigarettes to tower over him. "You gave me a curated exit. You didn't ask what I wanted. You didn't ask if I wanted to run. You just decided because that is what you do. You manage assets. You move shipping hubs. You relocate nurses." She leaned down, her face inches from his, her eyes reflecting the crimson light. "I need to know, Tae-Gun. Look at me, not as a patient, not as a witness, and not as a piece on your board. Do you actually love me? Or do you just love the power of being the only person who can decide whether I live or die?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the flashbangs. Tae-Gun's hand, still slick with his own blood, reached out as if to touch the hem of her dress, then faltered. The king who had just unleashed a monster was suddenly small, stripped of his scripts and his surveillance. The silence stretched, riven only by the distant, muffled sound of his men retaking the elevator lobby. "I don't know how to love without holding on," he whispered, the admission sounding like a confession of a mortal sin. "In my world, if you don't hold something tight enough to bruise it, it gets taken. I saw you smiling at that phone, at a man who was a lie, and the thought of you belonging to a world I can't touch. It didn't just hurt, it destroyed me. If that's power, Talia, then it's a power that has me on my knees." Talia didn't pull away. She watched the pulse hammering in his neck, the thorn tattoo shifting with his shallow breaths. She realized then that he was telling the truth. He was as much a prisoner of his nature as she was of his penthouse. He didn't know how to be an equal. He only knew how to be a master or ruin. "Then let go," she commanded, her voice a low, fierce vibration. "If you want me to stay, it won't be because of a deed in France or a black book in my pocket. It will be because you finally realize that I am the only thing in this room you can't buy, and the only person you can't protect by hiding." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his, mixing their blood. It wasn't surrender. It was a challenge. She was wearing royal blue in a room full of shadows, and for the first time, she was the one setting the terms of the engagement. The heavy double doors of the medical suite didn't explode this time. They hissed open with a cold, mechanical precision that was far more terrifying. Framed in the flickering crimson emergency light stood Minho, Tae-Gun's second in command, the man who had been the shadow to Tae-Gun's light for a decade. He wasn't dressed in tactical gear like the others. He wore a sharp, charcoal suit, and his expression was one of disappointed pity. In his hand, a suppressed pistol was leveled directly at Tae-Gun's heart. "You let a nurse do what a dozen rival families couldn't, brother," Minho said, his voice a smooth contrast to the carnage in the hallway. "You went soft. You threw away the box. You threw away your discipline. And now you've thrown away the syndicate. The board can't have a king who bleeds for a woman." Tae-Gun tried to shift, his hand tightening on Talia's, but the blood loss had anchored him to the floor. His eyes, though clouded with pain, flashed with a final, desperate instinct to shield her. "Leave her out of this, Minho. She's just a help. She's the heartbeat you're following into the grave," Minho countered, stepping over a fallen tray of surgical instruments. "I'll make it quick for you. For her, I haven't decided yet." Talia felt the surge of adrenaline override the paralysis of her fear. She wasn't a soldier, but she was a doctor, and in this clinical sanctuary, she knew the geography of the room better than any assassin. Her hand drifted to the medical cart beside her, her fingers brushing against a pressurized canister of sevoflurane, a potent, rapid-onset anesthetic gas. "Wait," Talia said, her voice trembling with a calculated vulnerability. She stepped away from Tae-Gun, holding her hands up as if in surrender, her royal blue dress rustling against the marble. He's already dying. Look at his vitals. If you shoot him now, the alarms will trigger a full lockdown of the air filtration system. You'll be trapped in here with a corpse. Minho paused, his gaze flickering momentarily to the heart monitor, which was wailing a rhythmic, staccato warning. It was the only opening she needed. With a movement born of 6 months of clinical reflex, Talia didn't grab a weapon. She grabbed a high-pressure oxygen line and the sevoflurane canister. In one fluid motion, she sheared the valve against the edge of the metal table. A pressurized has filled the small space, a white cloud of concentrated anesthetic geysering directly into Minho's face. Minho lunged forward, but the gas was surgical grade and instantaneous. His aim faltered as his nervous system misfired. He coughed, his knees buckling as the world turned to gray fog. Talia didn't wait for him to hit the floor. She grabbed a heavy defibrillator paddle from the charging station, set it to maximum joules, and pressed it into the center of his chest. The crack of the electrical discharge was the only sound in the room as Minho's body convulsed and went limp, the pistol clattering uselessly across the floor. Talia stood over him, her chest heaving, the royal blue silk of her sleeve smoking slightly from the discharge. She didn't look like a nurse. She looked like the Reaper. She turned back to Tae-Gun, who was watching her with stunned, reverent silence. "I told you," she whispered, her voice shaking as the gravity of the act hit her. "I'm the only person in this room who decides who lives and who dies." The crimson strobes finally slowed, their violent pulsing settling into a steady, low-energy hum as the penthouse's secondary power systems fought to stabilize. The silence that followed Minho's collapse was profound, broken only by the sharp, metallic cooling of the overhead vents and the ragged, shallow breaths of two people who had just survived the end of their world. Tae-Gun remained slumped against a mahogany desk, his skin the color of ash against the dark ink of the thorns on his neck. His gaze drifted away from his unconscious second-in-command and settled on the floor. There, amidst the debris of the coup, lay the shattered remnants of the silver cigarette box. The white stalks of tobacco were scattered like broken teeth across the marble, crushed by tactical boots and stained with the arterial spray of the men who had tried to take his life. For 7 years, that silver box had been his gravity. It was the only thing that stood between the man and the monster, a cold, metallic promise that he could contain the fire. He looked at the wreckage now and felt nothing. The discipline hadn't just broken. It had been rendered obsolete. The anchor was a lie he'd told himself to avoid admitting that he was already drowning. His eyes shifted upward, coming to rest on Talia. She was still standing over Minho, the heavy defibrillator paddle hanging from her hand, her royal blue dress smeared with blood and drywall dust. Her hair was a wild, soft halo against the harsh light, and her eyes were fixed on his with fierce, terrifying clarity. She hadn't just saved his life. She had dismantled the architecture of his entire existence and rebuilt it in the span of an hour. "The box is dead, Tae-Gun," she said, her voice a low, steady vibration in the cooling air. She dropped the paddle, the heavy clatter echoing through the suite. The discipline, the king, the monster you were so afraid of, they all died the moment you realized you can control the way I look at my phone. Tae-Gun let out a breath, a sound that was half sob and half laugh. He didn't look at the cigarettes anymore. He reached out his good hand, his fingers trembling, not toward the silver or the ink, but toward her. "I don't need the anchor," he whispered, the truth of it tasting like iron and salt in his mouth. "The box wasn't keeping me human, Talia. You were. Every time you checked my vitals. Every time you looked at me with that clinical indifference that forced me to be better just to earn a second of your time, that was the only ritual that mattered." He looked at the scattered cigarettes, the special ritual of a dying empire, and saw them for what they truly were, a distraction. He didn't want the silence of the box. He wanted the noise of her defiance. He didn't want to control the king. He wanted the vulnerability of the man who was currently bleeding for a woman who held his life in a flash drive. "Talia," he rasped, his eyes locking onto hers with a raw, desperate sincerity. "Don't go to France. Don't go to the clinic I built in the dark. Stay here in the light and help me figure out what the hell we do with the ashes." Talia didn't answer immediately. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly against the marble, and knelt in the ruins of his office. She didn't take his hand yet. She simply looked at him, the healer finally seeing the man behind the patient. The power dynamic had dissolved into something new, something without a name, a partnership built on the wreckage of obsession. The sirens were no longer a distant hum. They were a rhythmic, wailing tide rising from the streets of Seoul, their blue and red lights dancing frantically against the smoke-stained windows of the penthouse. The elevator lobby was a graveyard of ambition, and the air in the medical suite was thick with the scent of copper, ozone, and the cooling mist of the anesthetic gas. Talia looked at her phone, which lay on the marble floor where it had fallen during the struggle. The screen was cracked, but a single notification pulsed in the dark. "I'm outside the violet hour. Table is ready. See you in 5. It was a 9 p.m. deadline. The escape she had spent 6 months meticulously planning was waiting for her just a few city blocks away. The ghost date, the one Tae-Gun had dismantled, had been replaced by a reality she could finally grasp. She could walk out right now, leave the king to the feds and the surgeons, and vanish into the southern France sunset he had prepaid for. She looked at Tae-Gun. He wasn't the unflappable king anymore. He was a man bleeding out on a sapphire rug, his unbuttoned shirt ruined, his special silver box a crushed memory at his feet. He wasn't watching the door, and he wasn't checking his monitors. He was simply watching her, his eyes wide and vulnerable, waiting for the only sentence that could actually kill him. Talia picked up the phone. Her fingers, still stained with his blood, moved across the glass with a clinical, final precision. She didn't call the police, and she didn't call a cab. "I'm not coming," she typed, her thumb hovering over the send button for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity. Something more urgent came up. She hit send, and then, with a finality that echoed louder than any explosion, she powered the device down and slid it across the floor, away from her reach. "The 9 p.m. appointment is canceled," she said, her voice a low, steady vibration that finally broke the suffocating tension. Tae-Gun's breath hitched, a jagged sound of disbelief. "Talia, the feds will be here in minutes. You have the papers. You have the clinic. Why stay for a wreck?" Talia knelt beside him, her royal blue dress fanning out across the debris like a spilled inkwell. She reached out and finally took his hand, her grip firm and grounding, closing the distance between the nurse and the monster. "Because that version of me, the one who needed a run, lived in a world where you were a god," she whispered, her eyes locking onto his. "But you aren't a god, Tae-Gun. You're just a man who breaks his own heart to keep a woman from seeing him bleed. And I find I'm much more interested in the man than the king." She reached into her trauma kit and pulled out a fresh syringe of morphine, not for his shoulder, but to steady his racing heart. This was her final prescription. Not a cure for his wounds, but an end to his isolation. "We aren't leaving for France tonight," she said as the first flashlights of the tactical teams began to sweep the hallway. "We're staying here. And for the first time, Seo Tae-Gun, you're going to let someone else take the lead." Tae-Gun leaned his head against her shoulder, his eyes finally closing as the morphine and the realization took hold. He didn't need the silver box anymore. He didn't even need the discipline. He just needed her. And as the world crashed through the doors to take what was left of the empire, the two of them sat in the ruins, finally, dangerously equal. The chaos had been contained, filtered into the clinical efficiency of the authorities processing the floors below. But up here, on the edge of the world, the air was still. Seo Tae-Gun stood on the glass-railed balcony, his shoulder heavily bandaged under a fresh coat of darkness. The Seoul skyline had transitioned from a bruised orange to a deep electric violet, the city lights flickering like a sprawling digital brain. Talia stood beside him, not as a nurse 3 feet away, but close enough that the sapphire silk of her dress brushed against his arm. The desk, that mahogany barrier that had defined their lives for 6 months, was now just a piece of furniture in a room full of bullet holes. The documents, the ledgers, and the special silver box were gone, replaced by a silence that no longer carried the threat of a predator. "You're still here," Tae-Gun said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that the wind tried to steal. He didn't look at the city. He looked at her, his dark hair messy, his eyes finally stripped the cold, kingpin mask. The tattoo of thorns on his neck seemed to soften in the twilight, No longer a warning, but a map of the scars they now shared. Talia leaned against the railing, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the mountains met the glow of the metropolis. The clinic in France is still there, Tae-Gun. The bank accounts are active. I could leave at dawn, and you wouldn't be able to stop me. Tae-Gun turned fully toward her, his good hand reaching out to grip the cold steel of the rail next to hers. I know. That's the most terrifying part of my day. He let out a breath that looked like ghosts in the winter air. I spent my life building a fortress, so I'd never have to feel small. Then you walked in with a stethoscope and a royal blue dress, and showed me that I was just a man in a very expensive cage. Talia finally turned her head, her dark eyes meeting his. The power dynamic wasn't just dead. It had been cremated in the fires of the penthouse breach. What remained was something far more volatile. A mutual obsession that didn't require surveillance or locked doors. It was a realization that they were two broken mirrors that, when held together, finally showed a complete picture. "The king is dead, Tae-Gun," she whispered, reaching up to trace the line of his jaw with a finger that still bore a faint, dried trace of his blood. "The monster is out of his box. So, who was the man standing on this balcony?" Tae-Gun leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as he surrendered the last of his pride. A man who has realized he'd rather be ruined by you than saved by anyone else. He didn't pull her into a possessive embrace. He simply waited, offering her the choice he had never given her before. Talia didn't hesitate. She stepped into his space, her forehead resting against his, as the final sliver of the sun vanished. They were no longer boss and employee, patient and healer, or captor and prey. They were two architects of a new, dangerous world, standing on the ruins of an old empire, ready to find out if love was just another word for a brand new kind of war. So here's what I need to know. When exactly did you realize they were always meant to end up together? Drop a comment and let me know. If you're still breathing after that finale, hit subscribe because I've got more twisted romances coming your way. And one last thing, what city are you in right now? I want to know how far this story traveled.